If you are new to this channel, welcome. This video is going to give you some advice that as you enter your journey into the world of vinyl records, these are things that you should always remember when thinking about things that you want to buy, etc., etc. They're very important factoids that I think get lost to a lot of new collectors. And if you're a veteran collector who clicked on this video to be like, what does this guy have to say about tips for new collectors? Please leave anything I'm leaving out in the comments. It'd be great for people that watch this video as an intro to vinyl to go down there and get even more information than the things I'm going to share here. But I'm going to keep it simple. I'm not going to overload you. I'm going to tell you 5 things that I think are very important to keep in the back of your mind when you begin collecting records. And things I wish I knew when I started. The first is everything is technically a limited edition. The thing that pisses me off the most right now is so many labels, especially major labels are the ones that are mostly at fault here, are calling everything limited edition. And if you think about it, let's go down the road for a second. If something is limited to 10,000 copies, that's a limit. There's a limit to that. The limit is 10,000 copies. It's a limited edition compared to what if it was 1 million copies. It's such a buzzword to try to get people to freak out and buy it before it sells out. And oftentimes, you know, if it's a big artist, they won't disclose what the pressing number is, and it still will sell out fairly quickly. So there is that element of, should I get it? Should I not get it? Will I regret if I don't pick it up? But the thing to keep in mind is, if you're worried about a record selling out, a lot of records, especially from indie labels and smaller labels, will list the pressing number. So you'll be able to kind of gauge, oh, like, will this sell out quickly, etc., etc. Another tip that is worth knowing regarding that is a lot of online stores, if you go to your cart and you add, let's say, 9,999 copies of that record to the cart, not all the time, but often it'll auto-correct when you go forward to try to check out to how many copies are currently available in the store. So sometimes it's just a generic number that's a placeholder that kind of throws you off, like it might default back to 5 or 10 just because that's like the max purchase limit. But oftentimes it'll be like, oh, 371 is the max you can purchase. Then you can be like, oh, wow, this probably had a run of 500, even if they weren't explicit about it. So that's a little tip if you didn't know that. It's helped me many times to gauge, oh, I could maybe hold off on buying this, or, oh, I need to buy this today or it's going to be sold out. But remember, everything is technically a limited edition. If they're not upfront about what that means, assume it's probably a bigger run than you think. Number 2, I've talked about this in a previous video, but I think it bears repeating. 180 gram is a scam. That's my catchphrase I'm trying to get really pushed into the vinyl community. What I mean by that is that it doesn't really mean anything. 180 gram is a buzzword that labels use to make their records sound like they sound better, or more deluxe, or higher quality than a non-180 gram. And in essence, it's sometimes true and sometimes not. 180 gram means the record is a little thicker, so theoretically it should take longer to wear out. Theoretically it should have less of a chance of warping. What I will say is this: I don't think I've noticed a discernible difference in terms of warping. Lately, QC is bad across the board, so I have records that are 150 gram that are perfectly flat. I have 180 gram ones that are absolutely warped on as soon as I open them and I start to play them. So 180 gram isn't anything more than just, oh, I have a slightly thicker record. It doesn't really mean anything for the sound quality. It can still have an awful audio source. It can be mastered improperly. It can be cut improperly. Just because of the thickness, it doesn't equate to sound quality. So I feel like a lot of people get excited like, oh, and it's 180 gram, as if it adds value. All it really does to me is add cost to the pressing for them, and that causes them to raise the price of the pressing for us. So I would do away with 180 gram completely. It wasn't a thing back in the day, and some of the 60s, 70s, 80s records I own are amazing. I really think is unnecessary, but to each their own. I just wouldn't put too much stock into it. The third one is an interesting thought exercise because it's hard to necessarily wrap your head around this mentality. When you discover a record exists and you're like, oh man, it's out of print, but I really want it. I'll pay a crazy premium, $300 for it. You have to sit back and realize this. For the most part, everything will be repressed. There are exceptions to this. If they lost the original tapes, and usually there's something acknowledging that, where, oh, the tapes were destroyed or lost somewhere if you do your research. Or if the rights for the album are really tied up with a defunct label that maybe they have a bad relationship with, or the label doesn't exist anymore, but there's a bunch of legalese that makes it so they can't actually take it and own the material to press on their new label. Those situations do arise, but for the most part, almost every record I've ever wanted since I started collecting records has been repressed. When I started, there were so many things on my want list that I was like, oh, these are out of print. I'm never going to be able to afford these records that cost $200-$300. They've all been repressed to some capacity. And now what's worth saying is that the represses aren't always going to be better sound quality. So that's something you got to assess when the repress comes out. But if you wait long enough, what you want will eventually come out. If it's hyper niche, maybe not. But if it even has a remote audience, labels know there's money to be made, and the reason it's not being pressed right this second is a mixture of the pressing plants being backed up and probably some larger rollout to coincide with some kind of anniversary. It's really tempting to bite the bullet and pay for a really overpriced record, and I've done it plenty of times, and I'm sure you have as well. But I will say this, if you are patient and you appreciate all the records you do own, which I know you don't, I don't, I always neglect them. The newer thing is the shinier thing is the better thing. I understand that mentality. I fall prey to it as well. But taking the time to re-listen to some of the records you own and love allows you to wait for that repress to inevitably be announced. And when it does, you will feel so much relief that you did not just buy a copy for $250 on Discogs when it goes up for $30 2 weeks later. So worth thinking about. The fourth thing is something I did an entire video on, but I'm going to just glance over it right now. Be okay with imperfections. Vinyl inherently is an imperfect medium. There are going to be slight issues. You are going to have records that have a little bit of popping. You're going to have records that have a little bit of surface noise. You're going to have records that have a little bit of wear on the jackets, maybe some corner dings, maybe some little tiny partial splits. Maybe even the record has a little bit of a warp and it plays perfectly, but when you look at it on the turntable, you're like, oh, I hate that it's just a little bit, like it's just a little off and it's throwing me off. These things are unfortunate, and I know the argument is, I want what I pay for, and I want to get what I pay for, and I paid for a perfect copy. And sure, in a perfect world, that is totally true. But you have to look at vinyl, in my opinion, as an imperfect medium as a whole, and you're really able to pull a lot of magical qualities out of it if you have everything right, whether it's a good pressing mixed with a good setup, and you're in a good mood, and you listen to your record, some really special things can happen. But you have to understand that if you want perfectly clean, you gotta go digital, you gotta go CDs, you gotta go streaming. Those things are perfectly homogeneous, and you will get the exact replication of the recording you want, but it will lack some of the magic. The reason I love vinyl is there's that element of warmth, that element of a unique sound. Not always a better sound, but a different sound, a special sound. And with that comes imperfections. You gotta just let the pops go. If it's really loud machine gun pops on one side, you probably have a defective copy and you might want to get a replacement. But if you have the occasional crackle and pop throughout, you can't let it bother you. And if it does, vinyl might not be for you, because I'm a little OCD with this stuff, but I've had to learn and train myself to really take a deep breath and know that, okay, this is going to have a few imperfections, but the rewards and the pros certainly outweigh the cons. Last but not least, this kind of goes with the 180 gram thing. The word audiophile means nothing when it's on packaging. Audiophile is another buzzword that labels use to make their records sound like it's worthy of a higher price, or to make you believe that it's going to be sounding above and beyond an average pressing. Audiophile means someone that's, really into audio, but that doesn't mean that the pressing is of audiophile quality. To know if that's the case, you really gotta look for a few things. The first being from the original master tapes. That usually is a great sign. If you see A-A-A, that means it's an all analog recording. It's also worth doing your research and looking into who cut the record. I mean, if you get people like Bernie Grundman and Kevin Gray and some of the big names, Chris Bellman, and you know that those are the people that worked on the record, odds are it's gonna sound pretty damn good. And audiophile is a way that they lure newbies in to be like, oh, it's going to be an audiophile pressing, and then you get it and you're like, it sounds okay. It's because they just said that. It doesn't mean anything. So make sure you're smart about your purchases, and when you're looking into stuff, you really take the time to acknowledge, okay, is this going to be a good pressing? And a lot of the time you can go on Discogs and look at the notes of people's reaction to the pressing, and if it's a bad pressing, you'll know pretty quickly. So those are some tips I feel like every fan should know when you get into vinyl. If I missed some, which I'm sure I did, please leave a comment with them. I'd love to read them, and I'm sure those who are new to the hobby would love to read them too. So thank you guys for watching this video. More coming soon. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Take it easy.